Have you ever stared out of a plane window 30,000 feet above the earth and wondered, what if something went wrong up here and no one noticed? What if the cabin went silent, not from turbulence or an engine noise, but from something much more sinister? Something invisible? Today's story isn't about flames or mid-air explosions. It's about silence, about oxygen or the lack of it, and how a single switch, yes, a switch, became the silent executioner aboard Helios Airways Flight 522. I'm Eckhart Jan, and this is Error 1. Today we're talking about one of the most haunting accidents in modern aviation. A plane that flew itself across the sky for over 2 hours with no one alive at the controls. It was a bright, sunny morning on August 14, 2005 in Larnaca, Cyprus. Families were heading off on vacation, kids were excited, and the Helios Airways Boeing 737-300 was prepping for a routine flight to Athens, Flight 522. It should have been a 90-minute hop, the kind of flight where you barely have time to sip your coffee before descent begins. On board, 115 passengers and 6 crew members. Most of them were Cypriots. Some were Greek, and there were children, grandparents, and couples heading to weddings. The captain that morning was Hans-Jürgen Merten, a 58-year-old German pilot with over 16,000 flight hours. Experienced, calm, trustworthy. The first officer was Panos Protopapas, a younger Greek pilot with over 7,000 flight hours. Both knew the skies, but neither knew what was silently waiting in the aircraft pressurization system. Soon after takeoff, the crew stopped responding to contact attempts by air traffic control. A Greek Air Force fighter jet flew to Helios 522 to check what was going on. The pilot of the fighter jet could see through the window and noticed that the crew was unconscious. The pilots had lost control of the aircraft. It continued its flight towards Athens without any guidance or instructions from air traffic control. The airplane crashed 25 miles north of Athens near the village of Grammatiko in the mountains. There were no survivors. But what had happened? What led to this terrible accident? Let's take another look at the error chain again. Helios Airways was a Cypriot low-cost airline that operated scheduled and charter flights between Cyprus and many European and African cities. It was based at the international airport of Larnaca. Helios Airways was founded on September 23, 1998 and was the first independent private airline in Cyprus. It owned 3 airplanes, all of them Boeing 737s. Initially, they operated charter and contract flights. Helios Flight 522 was a regular passenger flight from Larnaca to Prague with a stopover in Athens. The Boeing 737-300 used for this flight had not been owned by Helios for long. Helios had acquired it a year earlier from the German airline DBA. The plane had arrived in Larnaca at 3:30 in the morning on the day of the accident. The scheduled flight was due to leave Larnaca at 9 o'clock. The stopover in Athens was scheduled for 10:45 a.m. Captain Merten was hired by Helios for such vacation flights. He was an experienced pilot who had been flying with Interflug until 1991, the previous East German flag carrier. The first officer, Protopapas, had flown exclusively for Helios for the last 5 years. When the aircraft arrived in Larnaca from London the morning before the accident, the previous flight crew had reported problems with one of the rear door seals. Therefore, the service door had to be checked. One of the technicians examined it, but could not find any abnormalities. A pressure test of the cabin was carried out, but also without any anomalies. The technicians wrote it off and released the airplane as fully functional. The aircraft took off at 9:07 a.m. During climb-out, the cabin pressure slowly decreased. At 12,000 feet, suddenly the pressure altitude warning sounded. The cabin pressure was too low. In such situations, the crew is supposed to put on the oxygen mask immediately and abort the climb. Unfortunately, this warning was misinterpreted. The crew assumed that the loud warning sound was a mistake. The same warning sounds if the aircraft is not configured correctly during takeoff, for example, if the landing flaps are not set correctly. The alarm is identical for both warnings. Now things got hectic, as several other warning lights also came on in the cockpit. At the same time, warning lights for the device cooling system came on. Various electrical devices and computers below the cockpit generate a lot of heat and therefore need to be cooled down by the fan. The master caution warning, a main warning light, also lights up during the warning for the so-called equipment cooling fans. The captain immediately contacted the technical control center in Larnaca by radio. He reported, "Takeoff configuration warning on," and "equipment cooling fans off." Regarding the equipment cooling fans, the technician explained,
"This is normal,"
and asked the captain to confirm the problem,
because it made no sense as the lights are normally switched off when the system is operational.
The captain replied,
"They are not switched off."
The captain's answer made no sense. Instead, he was asked to check the cabin pressure setting.
"Can you confirm that the switch is set to automatic?"
However, the captain only replied,
"Where are the fuses for my equipment cooling fans?"
his voice already sounding off. Presumably, there were already the first signs of hypoxia, a lack of oxygen at this point. The technician replied,
"Behind the captain's seat."
The captain stood up to look for the fuses. Then he collapsed unconscious. This was the last communication with the plane. In the meantime, the passenger oxygen mask fell out of the cabin ceiling, an emergency function when the cabin altitude exceeds 14,000 feet. The aircraft continued to climb to flight level 340. Between 9:30 and 9:40, the Nicosia air traffic controllers repeatedly tried to contact the aircraft without success. As it approached Greek airspace, controllers tried to make contact again, and again, and again, but without any answer. At 10:40 a.m., the aircraft flew over Kea VOR radio beacon into a holding area. The aircraft was still on autopilot at the cruising altitude of flight level 340 when it flew holding patterns for 70 minutes. Military jets were scrambled. 2 Hellenic Air Force F-16s intercepted the airplane north of Athens. And this is where it's getting chilling. The fighter pilots flew alongside their 737 and saw something no one should ever see. The captain slumped over, mask dangling, the cockpit windows fogged from condensation. But then they noticed movement. A person, someone was in the cockpit. Later was established who this person was. It was Andreas Prodromou, a 25-year-old flight attendant. He was a trained pilot himself, still working on his commercial license. Somehow he had managed to grab a portable oxygen tank. He was the only one conscious. He was in uniform. He took the captain's seat and tried to take control. The fighter pilots watched as he waved, pointed at the instruments, tried to steady the airplane. But he was too late. By then, the engines had begun to flame out. The aircraft had ran out of fuel after flying on autopilot for over 2.5 hours. The accident investigators later concluded that although Prodromou held a pilot license, his experience was clearly insufficient to maintain control of the airplane, particularly when the first engine failed. Despite this problem, he managed to steer the plane away from Athens and toward a rural area. It was thanks to his efforts that the aircraft did not crash in the city or a densely populated region. At 12:03 p.m., the plane descended in a slow spiral and crashed into a hillside near Grammatiko just north of Athens. There were no survivors, and 121 souls lost their lives. The investigation commission immediately launched its investigation and quickly uncovered that the aircraft had experienced technical issues prior to the accident. 8 months earlier, there had been a similar incident involving a loss of cabin pressure. On December 16, 2004, the aircraft suffered a sudden drop in pressure during a cruise flight from Warsaw to Larnaca. However, the investigation at the time failed to determine a clear cause, and the case was subsequently closed without resolution. There was another problem on the machine with the equipment cooling fans described above. In the 8 weeks before the accident, there were frequent problems with the fans. They were checked by the technical department in at least 7 cases. In most cases, the technicians wrote off the problem with the words, "Please continue to observe and report." Not really satisfactory, as the investigation commission found. In general, Helios Airways had major problems with finding and, above all, retaining qualified staff. In the years since it was founded, Helios had repeatedly looked for and hired new technicians. Many of them left the company after a very short time. To avoid this problem, it was decided to contract an external company to maintain their airplanes. ATC Lesham from England was commissioned to do this. They regularly sent technicians to Cyprus to carry out the tasks. The investigation commission was convinced that the very high turnover rate was not really helpful in ensuring continuous and safe maintenance of the airplanes. This did not come as a surprise. Helios had been audited a year earlier, and the audit revealed serious deficiencies. It had so many maintenance-related problems that the Civil Aviation Authority threatened to revoke the airline's license. They demanded that all outstanding issues were resolved by December 2004. Internally, however, Helios was mainly arguing about responsibilities and wanted to pass the buck to the contracted maintenance company Lesham. Somehow, an agreement was reached and the Cypriot Aviation Authority was convinced. Another audit in April 2005 again revealed many deficits. Long before the accident, there were serious deficiencies. It was found that neither, I quote, "the management nor leadership of Helios Airways was adequate or sufficient." The report also stated that the company had too few resources, which means lack of staff. In addition, the existing employees were insufficiently qualified or trained for their tasks. Technical problems were hardly ever fully and sustainably resolved. And this was also evident on the fateful day of the accident. Before every flight, pilots go through a pre-flight checklist, a ritual so ingrained it's almost sacred. Every switch, every dial, one by one. But humans are humans. The night before this flight, maintenance had worked on the airplane. They'd done a pressurization leak test and switched the pressurization control to a manual. Manual. Now here's the catch. In manual mode, the system doesn't automatically pressurize the cabin as the airplane climbs. It's like leaving the air conditioner off in a submarine. And the technicians had forgotten to reset the switch from manual to auto, which means automatic pressure control when they check the pressurized cabin in the morning. But even in such cases, there are always additional checks that could have prevented the accident. During the pre-flight check, the pilots have the task of inspecting all systems and checking that all switches are in the correct position. But when the flight crew came in the next morning, they didn't switch it back to auto. A tiny knob, a forgettable detail, but a fatal mistake. Apparently, the incorrect switch position was not noticed either during the check or when reading the checklist. So Flight 522 took off just after 9 a.m. and began its climb. After takeoff, there is another after takeoff checklist, a check to verify the correct switch position of all systems once again. But again, the crew did not see that the switch was still in manual mode. This meant that the aircraft could no longer automatically regulate the pressure in the cabin. The aircraft climbed higher and higher with virtually no pressure. As they passed 12,000 feet, something started to go wrong. The air inside the cabin thinned, oxygen levels dropped, but it wasn't sudden. It was slow and creeping. By then, both pilots were fading. The world was going dark. And here's the terrifying part. Hypoxia, the lack of oxygen, doesn't hit like a hammer. It's more like falling asleep. Your vision blurs, you feel euphoric. Your brain stops making good decisions. It's dangerous because the people affected aren't even aware of it. The time to react correctly, putting on the oxygen mask, is very short. At high altitudes, it can be just a few seconds. And this is why we are always being told by flight attendants during the safety briefing that we should first put on the oxygen mask ourselves if we lose pressure, and only then help children or other passengers. It's not helpful to put on a mask on our children first out of misguided care, only to pass out ourselves. And aircraft manufacturers have installed extra safety systems in the event of loss of cabin pressure. In the cockpit, a cabin altitude warning horn blared. It's a sound that pilots normally associate with something else. It is take-off configuration warnings. It's the same tone, and at that moment of confusion, the pilot started checking the wrong systems. You might ask now, why did they check the wrong system? The Boeing 737 was developed in the mid-60s and was first put into service in 1967. Many of the different onboard systems were continuously developed and improved over time. It is not without reason that this model is one of Boeing's most successful aircraft. However, one warning system has always remained the same over the years. It's the warning system for incorrect takeoff configuration and high cabin altitude. There's only one warning sound for both warnings. There were several incidents and occurrences in the past where pilots had confused these warnings. On December 14, 2004, exactly 8 months before the accident, an alert bulletin was published to draw attention to the risk of confusion. From today's perspective, it's almost unimaginable that an acoustic warning that sounds exactly the same is used for two completely different systems. After the Helios accident, Boeing mitigated the problem somewhat by installing an additional warning light for loss of pressure. In an emergency, the oxygen supply on the 737 is provided by chemical generators. Passengers are provided with approximately 12 minutes of oxygen via hanging masks. This is normally enough to get from cruising altitude to a safe altitude of around 10,000 feet, where the pressure and oxygen saturation is high enough without the need for additional oxygen. Flight attendants also have the option of using portable oxygen bottles. These contain significantly more oxygen and can provide oxygen for a longer period. This was probably also the reason why flight attendant Prodromou was still conscious and made it to the cockpit. During the crash, the airplane was engulfed by flames. Many of the recovered bodies were burned beyond recognition. However, autopsies of the victims revealed that all of them were still alive at the time of the crash. It was not possible to determine how many of them were still conscious after almost 3 hours of flight. The investigation was brutal. It revealed that all involved employees, technicians, and pilots had overlooked the fact that the pressurization system was not set to automatic. It was clear the pressurization knob, that single switch, had remained in manual. The system never pressurized the cabin, and the crew never realized it in time. But it wasn't just about a single error, it was about an error chain. To summing up, maintenance set the switch to manual and didn't return it. Then the flight crew didn't spot it during pre-flight check. And then the warning horn confused the situation. And finally, when hypoxia set in, it robbed them of the ability to recover. The investigation revealed many problems with the airline safety standards and safety culture. On December 2008, several managers and executives of Helios Airways in Cyprus were charged with 119 counts of manslaughter. The CEO, the flight operations manager, the former chief pilot, and the chief engineer all were charged. The lawsuits dragged on for several years. In April 2012, they all were found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in prison. However, the defendants were given the opportunity to buy their way out of prison for just under 80,000 euros each. Helios Airways ceased operations not long thereafter. But the story, this silent flight to nowhere, became a textbook case in human factors, cockpit resource management, and the deadly effects of hypoxia. Sometimes disaster doesn't scream. Sometimes it whispers. A slowly dimming brain, a sound mistaken, a checklist missed, and a sky filled with silence. Finally, Helios 522 reminds us that in the most technical computerized systems on Earth, it's still humans. Fallible, brilliant, fragile humans who hold the controls. And this is it for this episode of Error 1. Thank you so much for listening. And if you found today's story haunting or thought-provoking, consider subscribing or leaving a review. And if you're flying soon, don't worry. Every time a pilot checks that tiny pressurization switch now, they remember. And if you want to learn more about aviation investigation, you can now enroll at our acclaimed training and just visit aviationinvestigation.com or click on the link in the description below. With this in mind, I say thank you very much, as we say in Germany, bleiben Sie sicher, stay safe, and see you next time.